I love that song. I love the line, you didn't want heaven without us, so Jesus, you brought heaven down. That's incarnation, right? That's what this is about. My sin was great, your love was greater. Nothing can separate us now. It's just beautiful. So I think that's a real good segue into tonight, because we're finally getting onto Jesus. We've spent 3 weeks in the Old Testament cycling through creation stories, and now we get to Jesus and a really good creation story, one that doesn't fail, one that doesn't fall. So I've split this into 2 parts. So in the first session we're going to look at the ways in which the Gospel of John talks about new creation. And I couldn't take the whole of the New Testament because we haven't got very long. So basically, for brevity, I've cut it down to John. We're going to consider in this session how Jesus acts within this new creation. Well, how John lays out his idea for a new creation across his Gospel, and then how Jesus acts in certain ways within it. And we're going to look at a more detailed way that he acts within it on the cross in the second section. And then in a couple of weeks after Easter, so next week we've got communion, which will hopefully be wonderful. And so last week we did the temple, didn't we, with this idea of sacramental theatre. So next week we have communion, which is a kind of sacramental theatre. So we get to act bits of this out for ourselves, which is really exciting. So this week we're doing this new creation in John, and then the cross, and then we've got communion, and then on the final week we're going to finish off the Gospel of John and the other ways in which Jesus acts within it, and how he redeems us in the image of God. So we'll bring it back full circle, right back to week 1. So to finish off the Old Testament very briefly, we saw last week how Israel sort of institutes this temple idea, how they sort of cope with their sin. They have this coping mechanism where they renew the creation, and they believe that what they're doing atones for their sin on a yearly or daily basis. And from there they start to fall. And we see it even with Solomon, right? Like we said last week, how even the temple he builds with slave labour, and he starts to fall even in the midst of this. And it just sort of escalates and gets worse from there. So if they envisage Jerusalem and the temple as kind of a type of Eden, they get booted out of that as Adam and Eve get booted out of the Garden of Eden. They're sent into exile in Babylon, and this is horrendous for them, right? This is them in the chaotic wilderness. And even after they come back, it's still not quite right. They still have invasions from other people. And by the time you get to Jesus, they're occupied by Rome. So even though they're physically in the land, it's still a kind of exile, right? It's almost like Eden's been completely overrun by the serpents. Like they might be there physically, but actually it's nothing like what it should be. And so this is the context that they find themselves in. So we get to Jesus, and John starts his gospel off in a really beautiful way. And we actually do need to read it, so let's turn that slightly so we can see it. So I'd like you guys to chip in a little bit and sort of say what you see happening new creation-wise in these opening verses of John. So I'll read it out because it might be a bit small for you to see. Oh, handouts. We have handouts. Would someone like to hand some handouts around? Brilliant. Thank you, Daniel. Again, we've not got loads, so if you need them. And I'm so sorry that I sent them out really late today. I didn't start writing any of this till yesterday, so yeah, that's my fault. So, John starts his gospel with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The Word was with God in the beginning. So, let's stop there for a second. What creation language have we got in there? What's going on? There's no wrong answer. Well, there are wrong answers, but don't be scared to say wrong answers.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So, what creation language is there in that opening couple of lines? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. In the beginning. Really obvious beginning, right? Like, this are the opening words of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And John is situating Jesus right at that point. Anything else?
The Word.
Okay, the Word. What about the Word?
Whatever God says happens.
Okay, so in Genesis 1, God creates through Word, right? And John is saying that word is Jesus. That's fascinating. Is there anything else that we can sort of glean from those verses?
The Word is holy.
The Word is holy. Why do you say that?
In it's God's Word. God inhabits the Word.
Oh, okay. So because God speaks the Word itself is holy, and in some way divine. Oh, okay. So not only is Jesus the Word that God speaks, but because he's the Word that God speaks, he's divine, and therefore, in some sense, also is God. Is that what John's saying? Yeah. I'd go with that. So, I think maybe in the first week, actually, during the break, Christine came to me and said, "Well, we've got the Trinity in the opening chapter, in the opening couple of verses of Genesis. Like God speaks, and His Spirit hovers over the water." So, does John agree with that idea? Do we think? Yeah, I think he does. I think it has some qualification, perhaps. So, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Yeah. We'll get to the light in a minute. So, in some ways, it's splitting up. Okay, so in some ways, it's splitting up the Word from God. It's saying the Word was with God. So you have God and you have the Word, that they are with one another. But it's also saying the Word is God. So I can see why you'd see Trinitarian language in there. Actually, let's just go with that. Let's not complicate things too much. All things were created by Him. So this is what Naomi's saying, the Word, because God speaks the Word, and that's how creation comes into being. That's happening through Jesus. Apart from Him, not one thing was created that has been created. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. So someone mentioned the light a minute ago. So what are we saying about light? Who said light? Oh, Sandra. I thought it came from that side, sorry. Sheila, sorry.
It's mentioned in the first paragraph.
Okay.
Let there be light.
Let there be light. So this is the first thing that God speaks. These are the first words that we hear from God in the Bible. And this is what Jesus is. This is the light that comes. So that word that is spoken is the light for all people. And there's life, right? What's the goal of creation? The goal of creation, any creation, is life. And that word life is repeated a lot in John. I think it's about 50 times. Life, life, life. Creation language. And the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it. Okay, so what's going on there?
Darkness upon the face of the deep.
Okay, darkness upon the face of the deep in Genesis 1. But God speaks light.
Is darkness synonymous with chaos?
Darkness is not synonymous with chaos necessarily. It's more that chaos dwells in darkness to some degree. But interestingly, we looked at in the temple last week, God dwells in thick darkness as well. So you could say that the goal of God is to enter into the place of chaos and speak light into that place. And the darkness has not overcome it. So in some ways, they're not synonymous still, but we are sort of personifying the darkness into a kind of chaos type thing. We're giving the darkness action, and we're saying the darkness could possibly overcome something, but it can't overcome this light. Now the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. That's an interesting phrase. We'll get to that phrase in a second. Yeah. We saw his glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth, who came from the Father. So we have glory language again. So in the first week we looked at how the image of God is royal and crowned with God's glory, and Jesus also has glory. So he is in some way royal. He carries the glory of the Father. So this phrase, the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us, is a really interesting one. Actually, there was one more thing that I wanted to say on the Word. Now, last week we looked at the temple, and the Holy of Holies can be called the Devir. Remember, we've talked about how Hebrew uses consonants only, and then you sort of append the vowels to it to make it a pronounceable word. Well, Devir, if you take away the vowels, is simply DVR in English letters. If you append AA to Devir, it becomes Devar, which means to talk, to speak. And so the Holy of Holies has the same root word as speaking, which is really interesting. I find that really interesting. Let's see. Do I get to that later on? I hope I do. Give me just a second while I skip forward. No, I don't think I do, so I'll mention it now. So the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. So that's a really interesting phrase. Because in intertestamental literature, so the books that come between the end of the Old Testament and the start of the New Testament, there's a great swathe of writing in Judaism in this period. But we don't have any of it in the Bible. There's some in the Apocrypha and in other places. And there's a book called The Wisdom of Sirach. And a lot of these books talk about wisdom, the God's wisdom. And the wisdom of Sirach depicts wisdom as a woman, the same way that Proverbs does, actually. Proverbs talks about wisdom as a woman. So Proverbs is kind of talking about, and the wisdom of Sirach, they're kind of talking about wisdom as a female characteristic of God. It's the female, it's like this personality who speaks wisdom to people. And Sirach is really interesting because Sirach talks about wisdom being the word that God speaks. And that one day, that wisdom, personified as a woman, will come and pitch her tent among people. Isn't that interesting? The word that God speaks, this wisdom, will come and pitch her tent among people. And this sort of twigged with me, and I've said this in a sermon recently, because one of the teenagers that I work with at the church, they asked me why Jesus came as a man, right? And they're really bothered about this, right? They're sort of like, why is Jesus a man? It's not fair. Is God a man? And actually, no, I don't think so. I think that what John is hinting at here when he uses this phrase, pitched his tent among us, or tabernacled among us, he's hinting that this incarnation of Jesus coming in the flesh, this is an incarnation of a female characteristic of God. So it's not that Jesus comes as a man because God is a man. I think Jesus might come as a man so that the male side of God might get fair representation. Yes, Naomi.
Did he also come as a man because he was perhaps more accepted in society? Well, no.
Oh, yeah.
And also people would be listened to, or like...
Yeah, in terms of cultural reasons, like he could become a rabbi and all that kind of thing. Yes, there are cultural reasons as well, I think. But I think this is something that John is hinting towards, that actually Jesus is a perfectly balanced human being. He is the Word, the wisdom of God, in the form of a man. It's kind of interesting. Feel free to completely disagree on that. If you don't like that idea, I can understand why it might make you squirmy. So, let's move back to Genesis 1 for a minute, and let's think briefly about the ways in which the days of creation are structured. So they have a really interesting structure. So the first 3 days, God separates something from something. So on day 1, he separates light from darkness. Day 2, he separates waters above from waters below. And on day 3, he separates waters from land. And then over the next 3 days, days 4, 5, and 6, he populates the things that he separated on the first 3. So on day 4, the sun and the moon populate the light from the darkness. So the sun has authority over the light. The moon has authority over the dark. On day 5, fish and birds populate the waters above and the waters below. On day 6, you have animals and people that occupy the land that's been separated from the water. So it's a really interesting structure. So you could also maybe talk of it in terms of, on the left you have static placeholders, and on the right you have sort of movement or action, living things. And the sun and the moon are kind of depicted as living things in Genesis 1. They are given authority to rule in the same way that humanity is given authority to rule over the created order. And John in his gospel, so he starts off in John 1. This is a creation narrative. He's really blatant about it. We've just gone through it verse by verse and picked out all this stuff, right? And he goes on to create this same sort of structure through the rest of his gospel. So he creates like a spiritual version of this. So on day 1, we've just read it, he talks about the light. Jesus is the light. And then on day 4, he talks about authority and judgment. So in the same way that the sun and moon have authority and rule, so Jesus is the light on day 1, and then on day 4, which is, let's think, so chapters 7 to 13, roughly, of John. Jesus has authority in those chapters. It's kind of this balance. And the greatest demonstration of that authority is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which is John something, 12, I think. So in that passage, it depicts him having judgment and authority, and then it talks about light, and then it puts the two together. It's kind of tying the two together. Day 2 of John, which is kind of chapters 2 through to about 6, there's a lot of water imagery. So as God separates the waters above from the waters below, so John talks about water a lot in his day 2. So he turns water into wine at Cana. That's his first miracle. John the Baptist separates the waters in baptism. He goes and talks to a woman at a well, and he offers her living water. He goes back to Lake Galilee. He performs a healing at Cana, where he'd previously turned water into wine. He heals at the pool of Bethesda. In John 3, he has a conversation with Nicodemus, and he talks about being born from above. So we have the separation of above and below from Genesis. And then in John 6, Jesus walks on the water, right? You can't get more blatant than that. Why is it important that Jesus is shown to have authority over water? Particularly represented by walking on water. Why is that important? Because chaos monsters live in water. Yeah. Did I mention it in week 1? Perhaps. Psalm 89 depicts first God on the waters, and then that authority is given to David the king as being over the waters. And being on the water is a good depiction of royal authority. This is the way that the ancient people talked about royal authority, and how they came to think of royal messianic authority in particular. And it's image of God language. Jesus has authority over the waters. Someone once told me actually that, oh no, it's not important. Someone once told me there's a really high ratio of Christian surfers to the population, right? Like, I know you get like statistical anomalies, right? But I kind of like this idea that there are a lot of Christian surfers because something within them is saying, I should be on the water somehow. I don't know if that's whatever. So John's day 2. So we talked slightly about Nicodemus there, about being born from above. John's day 2 contains a lot of above and below language as well. So it has water, but it also has above and below language. So John the Baptist talks about Jesus being from heaven and not from earth. The woman at the well seeks the Messiah on a mountain. This is above language. The official son is raised up. The guy at the pool of Bethesda wants to stand up. Jesus talks about, and he prophesies the resurrection of everybody. And he talks about bread coming from heaven. There's all sorts of above and below language going on in John's day 2 as well. So if his day 2 is water, and he's talking about above language, and being born from above and that kind of idea, we'd expect that his day 5 would talk about those who dwell within the water, right? The chaos monsters of day 5. So his day 5 is sort of chapters 14 to 19. And right in the middle of that, we have Judas Iscariot. And John the Baptist sets this up on day 2, and he says that as Jesus is from heaven, so there are those who are from the earth. And then in day 5 we talk about those who are from the earth. So again, as we talked about either last week or the week before, how the earth or the desert can also be a place of chaos. So John the Baptist is talking about a similar sort of thing, from the heaven or from the earth. And something really interesting happens, and no other gospel writer talks about this. When they go to arrest Jesus, I'll read it out actually. Jesus asked them, "Who are you looking for?" And they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. Then when Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. So those who arrest Jesus, they return from where they come from. They go back to the ground. They're seeking earthly things, not heavenly things, as John the Baptist had talked about. And also in John's day 5, there's this increasing notion of chaos and misunderstanding among the disciples. They continually don't get what Jesus is saying during that day 5. It's like chaos is swirling around them. They don't know where Jesus is going when he says he's going to go to the Father. They don't know why he shows himself to the disciples but not to anybody else. Like, why are you keeping yourself hidden from people? I don't get it. They don't understand his words. So a couple of those in chapter 14, one's in chapter 16. And so we'll talk a bit more about how the disciples act in day 5 in a bit. But let's look at day 3 briefly. So if day 2, the separation of the waters, is characterised by water in John. Day 3 talks about the separation of the water from the land, and then God plants vegetation on the land for those that come in day 6 to eat from. And John does a similar sort of thing. He talks about bread a lot in his day 3. So the stuff that people eat is his kind of image of vegetation in a way. So when Jesus has walked on water, the boat comes into land, which signals like the start of day 3, where the land is separated from the water. And also in that day 3 we have things like the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus says he's the bread of life, who gives bread from heaven, which is from above again, right? And the bread he gives is his words, which is interesting. His articulated speech as a form of creation. So we'll consider day 6 the image of God. That comes at the end of John. We'll do that after Easter. I'm really looking forward to doing day 6. Basically, Genesis 1 deals with the image of God, and so does John. Another way that John structures his gospel as the new creation, and the reason that I'm doing this is to sort of show you an overview of what John is doing across his gospel, so that when we get to the second session after the break, you'll be able to at least accept that John is doing some stuff in his writing. So when we get to the crucifixion, I'm hoping you'll accept more easily some of the stuff I'm going to say, because it's a bit out there. So another way that John does an overview of creation is he does 7 signs, which a lot of people have paralleled with days of creation. So this is quite a famous sort of motif in John. And this is actually, these 7 signs of John, and he signposts them as well, right? He says, this was Jesus' first sign, this was Jesus' second sign, and then you're supposed to look out for more. So this is usually as far as people go with new creation language in John. But I think there's a lot more, and we've sort of looked at a bit more. And I always find the water into wine one really interesting as well. And having done the Exodus, it's fascinating because it's a reversal of the first plague, right? Instead of turning to blood, it turns to wine. This is good new creation. So that's sort of an overview, a very brief, quick overview, and we could do more detail, of the ways in which John talks about new creation, and some of the ways in which Jesus acts within that new creation as well. So he, in some sense, is God. Boy, every sense is God, really. Like, the word was God. He is God who speaks creation into being. He's also the word through which God speaks creation into being. He's the perfect image of God as well in John. He's the perfect human being. He acts within and transforms the creation. He walks on the water. So he's the royal image as well. Paul puts it really, really well. He puts it better than I could, because, he's the Apostle Paul. So he says about this, he says this about Jesus. He says, he's the image of the invisible God, firstborn over all creation. For all things in heaven and on earth were created in him. All things were created through him and for him. So you have this wonderful sort of mixture of, he's God, and he's the one through whom God created. And it's, so he's God, and he's the word through which God creates, but he's also the perfect image of God. It's created for him. It's this wonderful sort of mixture of stuff that's going on. Jesus is all in all. He is everything. So we'll finish this session in a minute. This was kind of a foundational session for the second one. But I want to finish off with a couple of sort of what you might consider sort of mundane points, but will prove to be important. They'll be sort of crucial for understanding what we're about to do. So the first thing I need to do is talk a bit about the ways in which serpent mythology has progressed since the Old Testament, or since we last had a serpent way back in the desert, right? And then I need to talk a little bit about what they expected a Messiah to do. In other words, how they imagined a Messiah would instigate a new creation. So it's something very specific about the Messiah. So firstly, let's look at serpent language a little bit. So the serpent and chaos monsters in general, now up until the point at which we last left the serpent, they haven't been associated with Satan or the devil, really, have they? But they begin to be conflated more and more with a Satan, or the Satan, or the devil, or Lucifer, Prince of Darkness, whatever you want to. More and more sort of gradually through the Old Testament, but particularly in the intertestamental period. So a lot of the intertestamental books will start to conflate these two. But by the time Jesus turns up, they're almost synonymous. The Satan is the serpent of Eden. Right, you don't really get this sort of language in the Old Testament so much, but their language about it has evolved to some degree. And I've put a bit of information in the footnotes about that. So the serpent kind of becomes a picture or a representation of the devil. With this development of mythological language associated with the serpent, you get a development of messianic expectation alongside it. So because the serpent is the evil one who's trying to drag people away, you have this counterpoint which needs a Messiah to rescue them from that. So Satan doesn't really start off as like this individual adversary of God, but he becomes so in their thinking. And so as Satan becomes more individualized, so the idea of a Messiah becomes more individualized over time. And this is one of the ways that they start to interpret this verse in Genesis 3. So we've not looked at this verse yet. We did the fall in quite a lot of detail, but we sort of omitted this verse. So this is God speaking to the serpent after the fall. And he says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed, Zerah, and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Right, so several places in the Bible sort of talk about a messianic deliverer who will be anointed to exercise this final delivery over the serpent. So I think I may have put this in your footnotes, but I'll mention them just in case I haven't, and it's possible I haven't. So Numbers 24:17 talks about it a bit, Jeremiah 23 and Jeremiah 30, and Habakkuk 3:13 as well. So that's kind of a little bit on the serpent, and I'm not going into the kind of detail that I'd like to, mostly for time, really. But that's kind of the broad sweep of what we need to know about the serpent going into the next session. Let's also consider briefly something that the prophet Isaiah talks about in relation to this Messiah that's going to come and rescue them from the bite of the serpent. So, in John 3, Jesus has this conversation with Nicodemus, who's this Pharisee, religious leader. And we have this rather odd verse in the middle of this talk. And this is why I did the Numbers story, right? Why I did the fall in the desert. Because Jesus says this to Nicodemus. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Now, the Son of Man is Jesus. We really don't have time to talk about what the Son of Man means. But let's just take it as Jesus. So that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. What's going on in that verse? What does it mean that Jesus will be lifted up like a serpent in the desert, bearing in mind that by this point, the serpent and the Satan have become almost synonymous? It's kind of a really incendiary verse, isn't it? Now, when I was looking at commentaries on the Gospel of John, a lot of them skip this verse, right? They don't even treat it, really. Like, they talk about the eternal life bit, they talk maybe a little bit about the Son of Man, they ignore the serpent bit, because they don't like it, right? They don't say that, but it's amazing how much material there is on this verse. So we'll get on to implications of this verse after the break, but for now I want to concentrate just quickly on this phrase, lifted up. He will be lifted up. So we're in John's day 2 at this point, and again we have this above and below language. He's lifted up from the earth. So in the previous verse to this, Jesus has said that he has descended to the earth and he will ascend to heaven. And then he talks about being lifted up like the serpent on a pole. So he's sort of hinting that this is the way that he ascends. That's interesting. So we okay? All right. So first of all, this language, this lifting up language, isn't isolated to this verse in John. Jesus talks about it a couple more times. So in John 8:28 and in John 12:32. So both times he talks about when I'm lifted up from the earth. And John 12, John specifies in John 12 that Jesus is talking about the way that he's going to die. He's talking about the cross. He makes it really blatant. It's not like this language could mean something. No, John says this is crucifixion language. When Jesus talks about being lifted up from the earth, he's talking about the crucifixion. So we can assume that if that's the case in John 12, this is probably the case here as well. He's talking about the crucifixion in this verse. And it's a phrase, this lifted up, it's a phrase borrowed from Isaiah. And Isaiah 52, and it's in this sort of middle of this suffering servant messianic prophecy, where Isaiah says, look, my servant will succeed. He'll be elevated, lifted high, lifted up, and be greatly exalted. Which raises a bit of a question. So, it's a suffering servant, and in the moment of his lifting up, he will be exalted. So how does he suffer and be exalted at the same time? And it's not that he's lifted up and then he's exalted, or he's exalted and then he suffers. This is the same, right? Like, there's a couple of other examples of what Isaiah says across these verses. He says, kings will be shocked by his exaltation, because this isn't how he should be exalted. When was the Lord's power revealed through him? Well, maybe it's when he's suffering the most. We thought he was being punished and attacked by God. Well, is he though? Is he really? So the discerning reader of John, when he sees this phrase, he'll think about Isaiah and he'll think, is Jesus' exaltation in the midst of his suffering somehow? When we look at the lifting up phrases as a whole. And the other Gospels specifically say that the Son of Man must suffer. They say that really clearly. I think John might be using a really subtle device to make the same point as the other Gospel writers. So the second point to make about lifting up is how it's related to this other concept in Isaiah, that of like a signal flag or a standard being lifted high above the earth that draws all the nations to God and to God's city. So there's a few examples on the screen. He'll lift a signal flag for the nations. The examples there. And this again relates to this Abrahamic hope that there will be a blessing to the nations. And it's this idea again of a lighthouse on a mountain that draws the nations in. It's this signal flag, this standard. And maybe Jesus is alluding to this kind of idea. And Jesus says in John 12, actually, one of these lifting up phrases, and I, when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. It's this sort of Isaiah signal flag language. And we have this fascinating verse in Isaiah, which might tie a few things together. He lifts a signal flag for a distant nation and hisses for it to come from the far regions of the earth. This is God. He lifts a signal flag for a distant nation, lifting up, and he hisses. What a weird word to use. He hisses. It's pretty evocative, isn't it? So the image of Jesus drawing the nations to himself with hissing, after we've just thought about a verse where Jesus says he'll be lifted up like a serpent on a pole. Maybe there's something going on. But it is troubling, right? And you can see why the commentators ignore it a lot of the time. Because if Satan is now associated with the serpent, and the serpent's always been associated with sin and death at the very least, what does it mean when we talk about Jesus being lifted up on a cross like a serpent? So, we'll leave it there. Go and grab a drink, and we'll come back. How long do I want to give you for this? Can we come back at past? And we'll look at the crucifixion as a new creation event after the break. Thanks, guys. Right. Could I have a handout volunteer again, please? Kath, you're standing up. Brilliant. Okay, so we're getting onto the crucifixion now, and this is where I go a bit interesting. So I've called this session Christus Drama, which was the original name for the whole course actually, and I thought it was a bit obscure, so I changed it. So Christus Drama kind of refers to there's an atonement theory as to how the cross works, how we are saved, called Christus Victor. You may have heard of it. It's the idea that Jesus triumphs over sin and death on the cross. It's the idea that's most prevalent in the church for at least the first 1,000 years of the church. It's the atonement theory that most of the Eastern Church still hold really close. The idea that Jesus on the cross triumphs over the power of sin and death. And I want to do a kind of a take on that, but using these ideas of drama and theatre and entering into a story that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. So the ways in which Jesus acts upon a stage to rescue us from the power of sin and death. So we're going to tie together a lot of what we've done in the last few weeks. So last week we talked a bit about this idea of sacramental theatre and about how the priests act on the stage of the temple to redeem the sin and renew the creation, all this sort of stuff. And how it actually works, right? This isn't something that they're doing for kicks. It works. Like, it actually does redeem their sin for that moment. And then the next year, and then the next year. And it has to keep going and keep going. And the book of Hebrews talks about this, how they have to keep repeating these sacrifices, but Jesus puts a stop to them, right? But these sacrifices work in the moment. They actually do redeem the sin. So this is theatre that has efficacy. It actually has an action that really works in the real world. So I think one of the things that John is doing in his gospel is arguing or suggesting that some of the stuff Jesus does works in a similar manner. So he uses language that talks about Jesus acting within the world in this kind of way. And what we're going to talk about here is particularly in the last week of Jesus' life in Jerusalem and entering into Jerusalem and ultimately going to the cross. And his acting, it's kind of a method acting. You know, like we saw with Moses, where Moses becomes God to Pharaoh. And he really enters into that role. And for the scope of that story, God says, I will make you God to Pharaoh. And Moses acts as God in the story, like to the point at which, by the end of it, he's hovering over the Red Sea and separating the waters as God does in the creation. And Jesus will do the same thing. He'll method act his way into roles so that they actually have efficacy when he acts within that role. And I'm going to suggest that the ways in which Jesus enters into the story, and the story will be the creation story, because that's what we've been doing. In order to have full control over the story, Jesus has to play every role within the story. It's like a one-act, or a one-man sort of performance, a one-man play. This is why I've used this word auteur. So in film language, auteur refers to usually a director, but someone who has like a singular vision and a singular style that you can immediately identify as being, oh, that's his film. It's like Hitchcock or Tarantino, something like this, where you have certain tropes and certain motifs that are always in their films. And Jesus acts as kind of like an auteur, where he has full control over the direction that this play is going in, because he steps onto the stage and plays every role within the play. So let's get into it. And this is the moment we've kind of been waiting for the last few weeks. So we talked about how the original creation goes wrong and it's like a roller coaster that gets stuck in a loop-the-loop. This is the moment at which the roller coaster snaps out of the loop. This is where Jesus fixes it and moves the story forward and gives it somewhere to go and doesn't just keep repeating the same cycle. So this is the story that he's redeeming, the story of Eden. right? The story of the original creation. And these are the roles that he's going to play in redeeming this story. So God, Adam and Eve, the tree, which is almost a character in the story, and the serpent. So these are the characters that we have in the Eden story, and Jesus will play these roles. And what he's going to do by playing these roles is to ensure that the outcome is different this time. It won't go wrong again. So let's start with the crucifixion and the way John sort of situates the crucifixion to make it apparent what kind of stuff is happening. So his depiction of the crucifixion is sort of rich with creation language and these Edenic reference points. John is the only gospel that says that Jesus is arrested in a garden. So Matthew and Mark talk about Jesus being arrested in Gethsemane, but they never outright say that Gethsemane is a garden. John is very specific about saying this is a garden. Luke doesn't mention it at all, by the way. John is also the only one to identify that Jesus is buried in a tomb in a garden. So what we have structurally, literature-wise, is a really interesting thing going on. So we have Jesus arrested in a garden, and we have Jesus buried in a garden. And between the two, we have a crucifixion. So in ancient literature, they call this an inclusio. So where the bit in the middle, so if you have similar things either side, the bit in the middle is some sort of commentary on the outer bits, or has some sort of reference point to the bits around it. And what's really interesting is that Jesus is crucified in the middle, John says. So he's in the middle of two other criminals. He's crucified in the middle at the place of the skull. So he's on a cross, on a tree, in the middle of a garden. You have a garden either side. He's in the middle of the garden. So what might that? What's in the middle of the Garden of Eden? The trees, right? Tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. At the place of the skull, John says, the place of death. Well, the tree in the Garden of Eden is the place of death. The cross is also the place of death. It's really interesting what John's doing structurally enough, structure-wise. And you have a similar scene in the Numbers story as well, right, where the Israelites are meant to be in the middle of at least a potential Eden that's meant to bloom out into the wilderness around them. And in the middle of that, because the Israelites are sinning and they are falling, Moses has to plant a pole in the middle of it. It's a similar sort of image, right, where you have the pole in the middle and this is what Jesus is doing. And what happens in the Numbers story and in the Garden of Eden story is that serpents approach and the people fall. And we get similar sorts of ideas in the Gospel of John. The people fall in a similar way to the ways in which Adam and Eve fall. And this is what Jesus is going to redeem. So we have this idea of idolatry again. So just to recap quickly, Adam and Eve fell through projecting false expectations onto the tree of knowledge. They wanted it to give them something it could never give them. This is a pretty good definition of idolatry, right? You project your hopes or your fears onto something that will never achieve it. And we were saying that the serpent on the pole in the wilderness is not quite the same as this, because they gaze at it and it really genuinely provides healing. So it's not like an idol that can't achieve what you want it to. It does achieve it. And Jesus' contemporaries have a propensity towards idolatry as well. So through the Gospel of John, Jesus critiques their idolatrous attitudes. So in John 5, might have these the wrong way around actually. No, they're both in John 5, that's okay. He critiques their attitude to the Sabbath. He says that they're almost idolizing the Sabbath, and he definitely says it about the Scripture as well. It's a wonderful verse where he says something like, what does he say? You look to the scriptures to find God, and you should be looking at me. Basically, that's a paraphrase. I can't remember the exact thing he says. But they're idolizing the scripture. And there's hints as well that they start to idolize things like the temple and the nation. And all these sort of pillars of Judaism have become exaggerated in their mind. And partly it's because they're occupied by Rome. And they want to get out of that occupation. And so they're looking to things that can rescue them from that. So a lot of, and this might be in your footnotes actually, a lot of, I read it somewhere earlier, so I'm assuming I put it in your footnotes. A lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls texts, which are, most of them are intertestamental, so they're just before the time of Jesus. They talk about, some of them are just after as well actually, they talk about the temple in these kind of terms, where it's this glorious temple that's being built. It's being built at the time of the Gospels, is going to bring back the glory of God to Israel. And they invest all this hope and expectation in the temple, that ultimately the temple will never deliver, right? And we know it doesn't deliver it. It gets destroyed in AD 70. But they invest this hope in the temple. They're idolizing it. They have a propensity towards idolatry. And one of these pillars is this Jewish belief in a Messiah. And we've mentioned it briefly in the first session. And so when a Messiah comes along and they start to think that Jesus might be that Messiah, they have an inclination to idolize Jesus. And we think, I mean, as Christians maybe we think, oh, it's impossible to idolize Jesus because he's actually God. Well, it is possible to idolize him if you are projecting false things onto him. If you expect him to do things that he will never do. That is idolatry. And what happens is that Jesus is really careful in the ways he acts, so that he both subverts those expectations and he doesn't encourage them per se. No, he does encourage them in some ways. Like he doesn't refute them, I think might be the best way to put it. So as they project their hopes and fears onto him, he allows that to happen. So we'll look at three groups of people to sort of explain this a little bit. So the first group is the disciples. So for the disciples, Jesus is the Messiah. Right, they start to come to this understanding. But he's not the kind of Messiah they expect or they want. So a lot of Jewish thought wants the Messiah to have this eternal reign on the earth, which Jesus subverts by saying, oh, I'm going to die, guys, right? I'm going to die. But they kind of ignore that. A lot of Jewish thought also wants a divine sort of warrior Messiah, basically to boot the Romans out. Like they want someone who's going to come in with a sword and give them an empire back, basically. They want the kingdom of Solomon back. And this expectation might be kind of enhanced at the beginning of John, where Jesus goes in and he cleanses the temple, right, and he drives them out, and it's quite violent. And it might be sort of, they might see that as, oh, he's getting ready for a revolution here, guys, right? He's getting ready to sort of drive people out and redeem the temple system that's got corrupted. And he's getting ready to be our king. And maybe he's going to do the same to the Romans. And they're also going to have assumed that he's the Davidic heir, the royal Messiah. So this is the Messiah in whom God would invest the kind of authority to drive the Romans out. And also the authority to then draw the nations to Jerusalem, right? It's this Isaianic hope again. This is what they're looking for. And as a result of this, then the Messiah would then receive some sort of divine blessing or divine glory. And in those bits in Isaiah, a lot of the Jewish texts leading up to the time of Jesus start to ignore the suffering bits of Isaiah. That becomes inconvenient in this context. So this is the kind of stuff the disciples might be listening to. And interestingly as well, some of Jesus' disciples are zealots. Does anyone know who the zealots were? No, Matthew. Yeah. So Matthew's a zealot. What are the zealots?
Revolutionary groups.
They're a revolutionary group. Freedom fighters, yeah. So Matthew's a zealot, Simon's a zealot. There's a fair amount of evidence, and N.T. Wright talks about this, that Judas Iscariot is probably a zealot. And the zealots are revolutionaries. They want a violent revolution. So it's interesting that Jesus has them in his inner circle, right? He doesn't ever say to them that we know of, we're going to have a violent revolution here, guys. Get ready. But just by having them in his inner circle, they might start to think, he's going to be our kind of Messiah. He sort of allows them to project onto him, their desire for a violent coup. He doesn't dissuade them. And actually, with Judas, even if he's not a zealot, Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. In John 6, it says that he knew, but he doesn't do anything to stop him. Right, so is this happening with the zealot faction as well within his group? He knows what they want, but he doesn't do anything to stop what they're planning. And it's interesting at the betrayal, when Judas kisses Jesus, what does Peter do? He draws his sword. Well, why on earth has he got a sword? I think he expects a violent revolution at that point. I think he expects, this is the moment. And Pete Rollins, who's a theologian, a philosopher, he speculates a bit on what Judas is doing. And this, you won't find this anywhere in the Bible, it's just kind of speculation, but it's interesting speculation. Maybe Judas is trying to spark a revolution by betraying Jesus. Maybe he thinks that Jesus isn't going to act unless I push him. And maybe that's why Peter's got a sword. Maybe Peter's like, yeah, let's go. So it must have been pretty shocking when Jesus goes quietly, right? When he heals the servant's ear. What's going on here? Maybe it wasn't quite the right time. And it's really interesting the way that Peter follows Jesus as well. And he sort of sidles up behind and sees how he's faring. And then he sort of denies Jesus. And he's like, I don't know him. Right, what's Jesus actually done wrong at this point? Nothing. But Peter acts as if Jesus is guilty. He doesn't want any association with him. Because Peter's been projecting these ideas onto Jesus. That this is what's going to happen. He's going to lead a riot. And Jesus hasn't done anything. But Peter almost assumes Jesus' guilt as much as the religious authorities do. And we'll get to them in a minute. Yeah.
That's all after the upper room experience where Jesus very clearly suggests that servanthood is an important. He washes those feet.
Yes.
And that has got to be balanced against.
Yes. Jesus does.
Just a few chapters later.
Yeah. So in the lead up to the garden, Jesus does. I mean, it's not like Jesus isn't clear about the kind of Messiah he really is. He emphasizes servanthood. He emphasizes peace. John talks about it being a gospel of peace. But the disciples don't seem to hear that stuff. When I say that Jesus doesn't dissuade them from their notions, he doesn't. He allows them to think that about him. It's not that he sort of says, I'm definitely not going to do that. It's more that he's like, this is who I am. And they throw other stuff on top of him as well. And I think I can build on that to sort of maybe persuade you slightly more. So let's move on to the crowd. Because I think the crowds treat Jesus in a similar way to the disciples. They idolize Jesus as their king. Right, and I don't think Jesus does anything to dissuade them from this. And this might help to answer your question a bit, Keith, because in this, Jesus does something specific that makes them think what they are believing about him is true. Even if he doesn't say anything explicitly, he acts in ways that make them believe it. So when he enters Jerusalem, when the crowd hear him approaching, they wave palm branches and they cry, Hosanna, Hosanna. And they worship him as king. This is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. And so Hosanna is like a Greek version of the Hebrew word yasha. which literally means to help, or it's like a beseechment. And it's often used in relation to kings, asking kings for help. And I think that's in your footnotes. Palm branches are what the people waved at the time of the Maccabees. So this is also between the Testaments. And I don't know if you know the story of the Maccabees. Basically, the Seleucids have taken over Jerusalem and the temple, and the Maccabees are this family that drive them out. And this is what they hope for from the Messiah now with Rome, right? And they wave palm branches to greet the Maccabees on their way out. There's also a verse in another book, Testament of Naphtali, that talks about palm branches being waved to greet a Messiah. And this crowd have also wanted to crown Jesus already as king in John 6. And he's escaped. He's like, I don't want that. But they're sort of thinking now, oh, maybe it's just the timing again, right? Now he's ready to come as king. But he doesn't refute their expectations of being a conquering king, right? Instead, he gets on a donkey to ride into Jerusalem. And I've heard a lot of sermons where they're like, oh, Jesus comes on a donkey because he's humble. He's not the warrior king they want. Well, John is really explicit. John says that it's to fulfill Zechariah's prophecy. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. Jesus is coming as king, and he really is king, right? But he's not the king they want. That's important. He actually is the king, but he's not the king they want. And we see that with the sign on the cross as well, right? The king of the Jews. He actually is, but he's not the one they're mocking. It's also the manner in which Solomon enters Jerusalem when he goes to go onto the throne. He enters Jerusalem on a donkey. Jesus is evoking Solomon, their great king. Jesus isn't dissuading them from their worship of him as king. He's encouraging it. But there's a bit that John omits from that Zechariah prophecy. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. That's all he quotes. Triumphant and victorious is he, is the rest of that Zechariah verse. Triumphant and victorious is he. Jesus hasn't come as a triumphant king, not at that point. John omits that. It's fascinating, but that's the bit that the crowds assume. Jesus' entrance is suggestive of a conquering hero. And the crowd think that's who he is. But they misunderstand. And Jesus almost helps them to misunderstand, right? He almost coerces them into it. And there's a reason behind that. And we'll get to that in a sec. First, the religious authorities. So the religious authorities idolize Jesus in a different way to the crowds and the disciples. So as the crowd and disciples project their hopes and expectations onto who he is, so the religious authorities project their fear onto who he is. And this is another form of idolatry, an unrealistic fear of something, like the god. So Molech would be a great example in the Old Testament, the god who demands child sacrifice, or he will burn you up or whatever. You idolize that out of fear, and the religious authorities idolize Jesus out of fear. And they're afraid of losing power. And with all of these things, you see like selfish ambition. It's the same thing as Adam and Eve. They want power. So as Adam and Eve wanted to grab power for themselves and grab divine authority, so the religious authorities want to keep what they see as divine power. So they also apparently think that maybe they think Jesus sees himself as a royal Messiah. And I think this influences Pilate's opening question to Jesus during the arrest, after the arrest. Are you the king of the Jews? Well, the religious authorities probably said, well, that's what he's claiming. And they don't like this idea. So they've witnessed the crowd's adoration of Jesus. They've heard rumours of what he's been teaching. And they also saw his cleansing of the temple, don't forget. So they've seen him enter Jerusalem as a king. They've seen him cleanse the temple, which maybe indicates that he wants to get rid of the current temple system. Well, that threatens them quite a lot. Maybe he wants to institute a new temple system. Maybe he sees himself as somehow a king and a priest. We don't have time to go into that, about how that's possible, but it is possible, and that's who Jesus really is. But this is what they think might be going on, that he's trying to get rid of them, and they're scared. And they have power. I mean, it is real power, even though it's in subservience to Rome to some degree. But they would lose power if Israel's Messiah actually turned up. And I wonder about us sometimes with this sort of thing. Do we actually want Jesus to turn up at any point? Because they're also concerned that as a consequence of this, if he starts a riot, a rebellion, what is Rome going to do? And they'll destroy the temple, they'll destroy the nation, they'll wipe them out. And so what happens is that they idolize the temple and the nation so much that they are unwilling to let God work as he will. If this really is the Messiah, they should be welcoming him, and instead they want to reject him. Because they'll do anything to maintain these idols. And the high priest Caiaphas even says this in the book of John. He says it's better, in John 11:49-53, he says, it's better for one man to die than the temple of the nation be threatened, basically. And the high priest questions him on this stuff, and Jesus doesn't refute him at any point. He stays silent most of the time. When he does answer, he's really vague and evasive. He allows the high priest to sort of affirm his suspicions about Jesus without ever confirming them himself. So we have these three groups, the disciples, the crowd, the religious authorities. They have one key thing in common. They all seem to assume that Jerusalem at Passover that year will be the scene of a violent takeover. A bid by Jesus to grab power. Some of them want it, some of them don't. But the coup is assumed, even with no explicit verification from Jesus. And in all these instances, Jesus allows them to project this stuff onto him. He recognizes the inherent idolatry within their hearts. And he acts in ways that draws it out into the open. This is exactly what the serpent does with Adam and Eve. We talked in the fall session about how they already distrust God. They already are dubious about his motives. They're looking for an excuse to grab the fruit from the tree. And the serpent's speech and the way the serpent talks to Eve draws that out from them into the open. And this is how they fall. Jesus acts like the serpent, drawing out the deceit that's lying in their hearts, drawing out this idolatry as they project their stuff onto him. So like Adam and Eve, first century people in Israel have a propensity towards idolatry. And like the serpent, Jesus unveils this. He's also the focus of their idolatry. So this is how he plays multiple roles, or one of the ways in which he plays multiple roles. So God is idolized in the Garden of Eden, right? In a negative way. They project their fears about his motives onto him, and it's not true. That's not who he is. They project this stuff onto him. They idolize God in a way. And the same is true of the religious authorities with Jesus. And the tree is idolized in the garden. They project expectation onto it, right? So Jesus plays the role of the tree in some way as well. So he fulfills like this tripartite role in the lead up to the cross, of God, of the serpent, and of the tree. And then it goes further. So idolatry really is the reason that Jesus is killed. And idolatry is the original sin, right? It's really interesting. When an idol is pursued really vigorously, and it's relentless, you pursue this idol, you want to give you what you expect of it. When it's finally caught, when you catch that idol, it's found to be wanting in your expectations. It doesn't fulfill what you thought it would. the response is usually devastation and violence. There's a really beautiful picture of this dynamic in the film, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. Has anyone seen it? Seriously, watch it. It's the most beautiful film. So, as you can tell from the title, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, the film isn't really about the plot, right? Because all the spoilers are in the title. You know what happens in this film. The interesting thing is why it happens. And so Robert Ford is this guy who wants to join Jesse James's gang. This is in the Wild West. And he idolizes Jesse James. He thinks he's the bee's knees. He thinks he's amazing, and he wants to join his gang, and he idolizes him. But he does join the gang, and he finds out that James is not who he thought he was. He doesn't meet his expectations. And his only response to this, to fill that sort of void that he feels, is to kill his idol. He assassinates Jesse James. And interestingly, at the end of the film, it shows that he spends the rest of his life playing James on stage, right, to make money off this. It's fascinating. Because he was a false image of that which he sought. And I think the similar sort of thing happens with Jesus. They're so disappointed that he's not what they wanted. Because if you have an object or a person onto which you project stuff and it doesn't have the value that you thought it had, the human response is to destroy it. So the religious authorities, they actually kill Jesus as the idol they still fear, right? They want to kill him all along. But the disciples, and well, more the crowd, but the disciples to an extent, at least through lack of action maybe, so Peter's denying Jesus. They kill Jesus because he's a representation of their misjudged hope. And it's like Adam and Eve passing the book. It can't be our fault. It must be that he has failed. So like the tree in the garden, Jesus is the idol onto which people project their hopes and fears. And he's nailed to a tree at the centre of a garden. He's the tree. And he goes to the cross playing the role of the serpent as well. So in this drama so far, we've seen how the crowd and the disciples and the religious authorities play the role of Adam and Eve. Right? So if Jesus is the tree and the serpent and God, the crowd and everybody else are Adam and Eve. They sin in the same way as Adam and Eve do. They fall in a similar way. Right? But if Jesus is the serpent going to the cross, or if Jesus is the serpent drawing out the deceit of the people, in the same way that the serpent in Eden draws out the deceit of Adam and Eve, the people's response to the serpent, in this facet of the drama at least, is striking. Right? Because what do? They reject the serpent. They have it arrested. They have it tried and sentenced to death. So Jesus as the serpent who's drawn out this stuff in them, he wants to be rejected because of what humanity has projected onto him. It's what humanity should have always done. They should have rejected the serpent. So, if the serpent, and Jesus is playing the role of the serpent in this bit of the story, at least, if it's not rejected, then Eden cannot be redeemed. Because the story will start looping again. The story has to go somewhere else. They reject it. So an early church father called Tertullian, he was convinced that Moses' serpent, the bronze serpent, was a prophetic symbol of Satan's coming defeat on the cross. And I think this is what's happening, right? So if the serpent has become almost synonymous with Satan, Jesus is acting the role of Satan, and he pins Satan to the cross. Humanity puts him on the cross. Now, if 3 or 4 weeks ago I'd have suggested that one of the intentions of this was to say that Jesus becomes Satan on the cross, you may have walked out straight away. But I'm hoping that I've made it clear that he's playing a dramatic role in this. But the drama works. It has real efficacy. So let's go back to that Eden story for a second and this really familiar verse. Between your seed, Zerah. Now seed can also be plural. So they take it as a messianic prophecy of Jesus defeating Satan on the cross. And it is, and we'll get to that in a sec. But it's also plural. It's also all of the seed of Eve. All of humanity will crush the serpent. Jesus crushes the serpent, but he also provides a way for the people to crush the serpent. He achieves Satan's defeat, and the defeat of sin and death, so this Christus Victor idea, by becoming the serpent and offering himself as a sacrificial victim for the people to crush under their feet. Satan's defeated on the cross because it's Satan who's crucified, in a way, in part. And that's crucial in part. It's not like it's only Satan. There are other things going on as well. He's the serpent rejected by the people. So humanity, and this is really interesting, has a role, and it's unwitting, which is crucial, in their own salvation. And it's always necessary, but it's impossible by their own strength, as we've seen previously. So, just as we said that the Israelites in the wilderness are made to look at the serpent on the cross by God. So Jesus talks in John 12 that he will draw all men to himself, all people to himself. People are compelled to look at him on the cross. And as with the bronze serpent, what they gaze upon is their own sin. Everything they projected onto him, lifted high for them to witness. And they are turned out from their selfish ambition, and they're forced to gaze upon that which they've done. They're forced to gaze upon the serpent that's bitten them, lifted high on the cross, and they're healed because of it. As the people in the wilderness are healed, so people are healed when they look at Jesus on the cross, because he is their sin. And Paul talks about this. In Romans 16, he says, the God of peace will quickly crush Satan under your feet. So that's an interesting verse. The God of peace will quickly crush Satan under your feet. So God does it, but under the feet of his people. This is what's happening on the cross. They're unwitting in it. They don't intend to do it. They're not sending Jesus to the cross because they think they're rejecting the serpent, but dramatically that's what's happening. So the manner in which Jesus reenacts this stuff is compelling. He reenacts Eden and he starts to redeem it, but it's not complete if he only plays God and the tree and the serpent. He also has to play the role of Adam and Eve, because so far we've only had the people playing the role of Adam and Eve with their sin. Jesus also has to play the role of Adam and Eve in order to redeem them as well. In order to redeem their part of the story, he has to take control of their part. It's a multi-layered drama. The crowds play Adam and Eve, so does Jesus. The crowds do this stuff, so does Jesus. And it's multi-layered. He plays various roles within it, often at the same time. So, yes, Jesus is crushed as the serpent by humanity, but he's also the one who crushes. Yes, Jesus becomes the serpent who's crucified, but he's also the archetypal human being who defeats Satan. Yes, Jesus is the victim of murder, but he's also God incarnate triumphing over the power of death. There's multi-layers going on. So if we go back to the most common interpretation of this, that it's a messianic prophecy, that it's Jesus we're talking about here. Bernard of Clairvaux has this wonderful phrase where he calls Mary the conqueror of dragons, because he says that it's her seed that will defeat Satan in the way that Eve's seed could not. And this is Jesus. This is Mary's offspring. So this role that Jesus fulfills as Adam and Eve, it's a prelapsarian Adam. Adam before he falls. And he does what Adam always should have done. He resists Satan. So in Psalm 110, it says that the Messiah will crush the heads of his enemies, like this chaos monster type image, crushing the serpent under his feet. And the serpent is expunged, as it always should have been, by Jesus. So just as we talked about with the priest, flinging the sash over his shoulder as a symbol of the serpent being constrained and held in check. Just as maybe the bronze serpent on the pole is also a symbol of this, of the serpent being constrained and held in check. So that's happening on the cross as well. The serpent is being pinned on it. So we've had this sort of overarching focus in John of a new creation idea. And then he hones in on the cross as this reenactment of Eden. And the people sort of incline towards idolatry in a similar way, and they fall in a similar way to Adam and Eve. And Jesus the serpent tempts and draws out the underlying deception, and God is distrusted in the story because Jesus is also God. Innocence is murdered, and the tree becomes the central focus of the whole story. And there are two dramatic deviations. So humanity kills the serpent, and a prelapsarian man, Jesus, does not succumb to homo incurvatus in se, a turning in of the human being upon himself, the selfish grabbing. Instead, and this is how Jesus plays Adam, he sacrifices himself for the benefit of everybody else. And it's impossible to sin, I think, when you're looking out for the interests of others, truly looking out for them. All sin, as far as I can think, is selfish in nature. Jesus sacrifices himself for everybody, and he plays Adam in that role. Now, there are implications with this, and the implications for our salvation and how that works, and all sorts of ramifications, but we'll get to that. I want to stop here, though, because I suspect that's hit you like a bit of a freight train, and it's gone a bit sort of The ways in which Jesus dramatically plays these roles, I think really works. I think it actually is sacramental theatre. He really does take on the role of Satan and defeats sin and death on the cross by becoming it. Paul talks about Jesus becoming sin for our sake. What do we mean when we read that verse? He really does it. He literally becomes sin. He becomes the people's sin as they look at him. And in looking at him, their sin is exposed and nailed to the cross. And he humiliates it on the cross. Now, I had no idea where I was going to finish with this. So I've asked Daniel to... He gets paid for this stuff, man. I don't know how to respond.